All right, we're about to dive into an idea that might completely flip what you think you know about language. I mean, forget everything you learned in school. This theory suggests that the rules of grammar, the very foundation of how we communicate, weren't taught to you at all. Nope, they were physically built into your brain's wiring before you ever even said your first word.
So, let's just start with what seems like a pretty simple question, right? Where does grammar actually come from?
I mean, the common sense answer is that we learn it. We absorb it from our parents, from our teachers, from just being out in the world. It's this external thing that we just sort of download into our brains. And for a long, long time, that was pretty much the only explanation.
But what if that's totally backward? What if grammar is more like a whirlpool in a river, something that just naturally emerges from the flow? This theory proposes something pretty radical, that the blueprint for all grammar is actually a product of your brain's own physics, and it takes shape way before you know a single word.
To really wrap our heads around this, we're going to take a journey. First, we'll look at how grammar could even exist before words. Then we'll see how the brain literally invents the idea of I and other. From there, we'll connect that directly to the physics of a sentence. And finally, we'll get to the big one, what this all means for consciousness itself.
Okay, so first things first, this whole idea that grammar comes before words. The core claim here is that babies have this deep, structural way of understanding their world, a kind of proto-grammar, long before they can talk.
You see, according to this theory, the brain is not a blank slate, not at all. From the very beginning, it starts organizing every single experience into this really simple but powerful triad. It carves out a stable sense of I. It labels basically everything else as other, and it's constantly mapping the relation, the dynamic connection between the two. This is the blueprint.
So, how does this whole process even get started? Well, it all begins with the brain's very first, and you could argue, most important invention, creating a stable center of experience, a single reference point in all the noise.
Your brain is just a storm of nonstop activity, right? So to manage all that internal chaos, it creates what this model calls a self-attractor. Just think of it like a virtual anchor, a stable pattern that everything else gets measured against. And that stable, virtual center, that's what we experience as the feeling of I.
Okay, so once a stable I exists, the brain needs a category for, well, literally everything else in the universe. And this is where the concept of other comes from.
Now here's the key insight. Other isn't some specific thing. It's simply anything that doesn't fit the pattern of I. So if the I is internal, continuous, and pretty stable, then other just becomes its polar opposite. Everything that's external, unpredictable, and coming in through the senses. It's a category that's born purely out of contrast.
And this leads to the next incredible leap. Once the brain has these two opposing patterns, these attractor fields for I and for other, it has right there the basic building blocks for the structure of any sentence you will ever say.
The takeaway here is absolutely stunning. Grammar is literally physics wearing a disguise. Those stable patterns, the attractors for I and other, well, those are what we eventually slap labels on and call nouns, subjects and objects. The dynamic interaction, the strain flows between them, become our verbs. And the underlying physical rules that dictate how they can interact, that becomes our syntax, the very rules of grammar.
And look, this doesn't happen overnight. It perfectly mirrors the brain's physical development. The brain first has to figure out self from other, then those patterns stabilize. And this is the crucial part. Words don't create these structures. They're just labels we attach to structures that are already forming. Syntax just naturally emerges from the most well-worn pathways between them.
So now, we get to the biggest idea of all. If grammar emerges from this physical structure of I and other, what else does? Well, this theory suggests the ultimate answer is consciousness itself. Now, this is a really profound statement when you stop and think about it. At the level of atoms and molecules, properties like self or identity, they just don't exist. They are not features of physical reality. A rock doesn't have a self, a star doesn't have an identity. And this leads us to a stunning conclusion. If I and other can't be found in the physical world, but they're constructs the brain created just to organize itself, then consciousness is the dynamic simulation that just happens when they interact. It's the theater created by these imaginary actors. And you know what? We see the most powerful proof of this every single night, in our dreams. When you're dreaming, there is no external world feeding you information. And yet,
A complete reality is generated. There's an I that acts and feels. There are others that show up and interact. Relationships, stories, and grammar all unfold. All of it bubbling up from purely internal dynamics.
So let's just recap this incredible 4-step origin story. Step 1, I and other don't actually exist in the physical world. Step 2, the brain just invents them to manage its own internal chaos. Step 3, consciousness is what emerges from their interaction. And language? Oh, that comes way later, as just a tool we developed to talk about this virtual world that was already there all along.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty mind-bending question. If the very I that you experience as your core self is a virtual construct, an invention of the brain designed to stabilize its own chaos, then who or what is the inventor?